And I think if that's the framework, then I think perhaps that opposition to multiculturalism becomes the center of the conservative movement, becomes the pivot, the cohering aspect, and it's the lens through which you look at the world. It also is a way of thinking about a political coalition. Instead of thinking about it in terms of demographics or geography, suburban women, or however you guys, we're thinking more conceptually here. I also think that it informs the rhetorical strategy. Now, when I say lens through which you want to see it, I think, for example, as I've written about the Kavanaugh hearings, we all saw them. Well, that was not a contest over a Supreme Court justice. That was not a fight over how to apply a set of rules. That was a fight over which rules to apply. When they thought, the other side thought that Kavanaugh was guilty until proven innocent, that wasn't a violation of a sacred principle of ours. It was a sacred principle of theirs, and it flowed logically enough from all groups are equal, or there's a hierarchy of groups all oppressed in some way. So I think that we ought to look at it through that lens. That makes it look like a political revolution, which it was. And instead of saying those guys didn't play by the rules, I think we ought to recognize they were playing by different rules. I think also that one more little example in the Kavanaugh hearings, as you know, the Senate Judiciary Committee had to treat the accuser with kid gloves. They had to get a woman to interrogate her, treat her with great respect. Now that was a political reality. They had to do that. But what we need to understand, I think, is that political reality was driven by multiculturalism. Right? That's multiculturalism at work, reinforcing the idea that all men are oppressors. And I think we ought to look at it that way. So, again, multiculturalism is useful, I think, as a framework, a conceptualization. And I think that's what we're trying to do at Claremont right now, is to try to provide that analytical framework. And I think from there, as the broad framework, I think we also want to help politicians and the movement think about the various policy issues that that we confront. Let me just say one other thing before I get to policy, and then I'm going to introduce David McIntosh. Everybody's aware of the free speech problem on college campuses, or the absence of free speech. But what we're not quite as aware of is the absence of free speech in Congress. That's the real damaging. And of course, they're connected. One comes from the other. It's the inability of politicians to defend America. That's the big problem at the moment, which is why we're now having a panel on what it means to be an American. So somehow, as I've been talking with David McIntosh, is how do you help politicians talk about what it means to be an American? First, you have to convince them that it's an important thing to talk about it. And there's a real big cost in not talking about it. And I think then you have to provide them this kind of analytical framework that we've been talking about. And the next level, David just gave me this sort of schema 2 seconds ago, but I appropriated it with impunity. So there's the framework, there's the analytical framework, and then there's the actual messaging. Now, how do you translate that into language for your various constituencies? And then there's also what is the mechanism, the vehicle, the content, or the environment in which you can actually speak. An individual politician can't stand up and defend America today without being called a racist, right? So how do you create the environment, the context? And probably you want to institutionalize it somehow. You need to protect people. But again, before you get to that point, people have to believe that there's a real reason for speaking up and a real cause for not doing so. I've mentioned David McIntosh a couple times. I do because, I should say, for those who don't know him, and I think many probably do, he is the president of the Club for Growth. I didn't realize it, but he's also co-founder of the Federalist Society. Congressman, ran for governor of Indiana. And what we've been talking about and beginning to do is see if we can't actually speak directly to lawmakers. And again, educating them, yes, but helping them think about this problem. And both helping them think about the analytical framework that I've been talking about, the messaging that they need, and the vehicle through which they can deliver this message. So that's part of this Claremont Multiculturalism versus America project. There's the intellectual part that we're engaged in, helping to develop the arguments, but there's also the more political part. So with that, I thought I'd ask David just a few minutes to give a sense of what this all looks like from his more political perspective.
Thank you, Tom. I wholeheartedly embrace your framework. Thank you. I don't have a prepared remark, so I'll just say a few things to explain essentially why I, in both capacities, as a board member of the Federal Society and head of the Club for Growth, think that what Claremont's doing is vitally important, and have encouraged Tom and Ryan to proceed with this and offered to work with them as the project gets underway to intersect with these political actors that we recruit. And to explain why, let me just recap what the Club for Growth really does. Through our political arms, we try to elect aggressive thought leaders and seed the Republican Party with those individuals so that they can lead the party in a limited government, free market direction. Therefore, we're very engaged in Republican primaries. So last cycle, we applied the new techniques of data analytics to really understand the Republican primary voter, because we were spending money engaging them, asking them to vote for candidates we thought would be excellent leaders. Divided it into 9 different categories. There's the free traders, the good government Republicans, the tribalists, we're just for a Republican. There's religious conservatives. But the largest, most potent element in that, and they overlap, so individual voters can be more than one of these categories. But the largest, most potent category was what we ended up labeling the category of racial resentment, which to me was disturbing, because from my youth, I was raised that racism is bad and that we have to treat everybody as equal. Thinking about it more and looking at it and analyzing what these poll respondents essentially were telling us, that is a group that Trump definitely excited in his election, and it's a reaction to multiculturalism or identity politics. It's voters who feel they're disrespected. One of the panelists used that word, and that we were picking up quite a bit. So the reason I think it's important to develop the intellectual framework to address this problem, and it's a growing problem that we're seeing among voters who are engaging now, is that we need the right intellectual framework for 2 reasons. One, the politicians aren't good at developing intellectual capital. And I wasn't when I was in elected office. You're spending your intellectual capital on a day-to-day effort to pursue some policy or political agenda. And so it's needed for leaders who share our viewpoint on this to have that well articulated, well thought out. The language will be needed as well. And Club for Growth has better expertise at that and can help. But we also need to develop the framework in order to make sure the response is consistent with the values that you all have labeled American. That it's very easy to, in a political environment, to take the resentment that is manifested when people feel that multiculturalism is against them or denying them their freedoms, as I think Henry put it, to channel that into policies or approaches or frankly, ultimately, efforts that would undermine and destroy the framework of liberty that we have. This is where my Federalist Society hat comes in, that is granted to us through our Constitution. So, critically important project for both reasons, to be successful in the democratic process and to make sure that the response to multiculturalism doesn't lead us in a direction that we as a country don't want to go, further away from America. So I'm really just here to say thank you to Claremont for doing that. And I've committed to Tom that we at the club will join in that effort in his third phase of identifying a group of people that can work together towards this project, both to provide protection for the thought leaders that speak up, but also to effectively inject it into the political climate, which is a great opportunity to change opinions in our country. So keep up the great work. Thank you for letting me say a few words, and I just appreciate what you're doing. Thanks.
So the topic of this panel, as you've observed, is American citizenship and national identity. Speaking first will be Michael Anton, a lecturer and research fellow at the Hillsdale College Kirby Center here in Washington, D.C., and also a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, and a contributor every issue now to the Claremont Review of Books. I encourage you to seek out his writings. They're excellent. And then after Mike, we'll have Charles Kesler, who's a distinguished professor of government at Claremont McKenna College, of course, editor of the Claremont Review of Books, a senior fellow of the Claremont Institute, and one of our board members as well. And then, I'm sorry, Charles will go last. You're going to back clean up, Charles. But before Charles, we'll have Colleen Sheehan, a longtime friend of the Claremont Institute, and a professor of political science at Villanova. And as she will talk about a little bit, is really on the front lines of this battle over identity politics and multiculturalism on the campus. So with that, I will start with Mike.
First, I just come up on tall sides. Maybe not. All right, I'll do my best to yell into the microphone. So first, I want to say, in sort of defense, excuse, whatever, for David Azrat, I texted him, doubting his explanation with a single word, flake. He has not gotten back to me, so perhaps he is ill indeed. But if he were here, he would certainly take the anti-multicultural side in the sense that he would say this is the wrong term to use. It has too much of a friendly or connotation that's been, anyway, sanitized and even glorified, and he much prefers the term identity politics, which still carries a lot of negativity, and people don't like that, and he wrote a whole paper about it earlier this year, which I urge everyone to read. It's great. So poor Azrat could have made the case for himself. I didn't do a great job, but I just wanted to get his notion in there. All right. I typically assume when I get invited to do something like this that I have an assigned role and, I should play it, right? I was invited for a certain reason, and my assigned role is to sort of be the scourge of the conservatives. I don't know how effective I am. I certainly try to scourge them. I hope they feel scourged. If they don't, maybe I'm not that great with the whip. But in this instance, on this particular instance, whether we call it multiculturalism or identity politics, I liken the conservatives to a certain sort of Looney Tunes character who taunts his enemy, draws a line, and says, I dare you to cross that line. The enemy crosses the line, the character backs up, draws another line, dare you to cross that line. Lather, rinse, repeat. That's kind of the conservatives in the multicultural identity politics debate. Or if I really wanted to be ungenerous, which of course I don't, but I'll say it anyway. Talleyrand famously said of the Bourbons after the Restoration that they had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. I think when it comes to this particular debate, the conservatives have stopped nothing and conserved nothing. Now, so I got to back up a little bit and give you a bit of a history. Oh, another thing I didn't actually know this. I'm embarrassed that I didn't know this. For some reason, the date in my head was April 27th, but a Publius fellow last year came in and reminded me that today is Machiavelli's birthday. So I begin with the Machiavellian term, disarmato, meaning disarmed. The conservatives are disarmed in the face of this challenge, and I'm going to explain why I think that is, or partly why it is. Okay. It requires a bit of a history lesson, right? Now, nations generally, we don't know how they become nations or how they come together. It happens over so many years during periods where written history either doesn't exist or is so tenuous and sketchy that you look back and you go, when was France no longer Gaul and it was France? Or when it was no longer Frankish and France? Hard to say. Historians can spend their whole career on it. You don't really know. That's typical of any nation you can think of. America is very much the exception to the rule because America came together as a nation, A, recently, relatively speaking, and B, kind of in the full light of the world with the printing press and records that survived. So we know how it happened, we know when it happened, and we basically know what happened. It doesn't happen very often. Now, America is a unique case in other respects in that these people who thought of themselves primarily as English for a century and a half or so had to come up with a new identity. And they had to come up with a new basis for political legitimacy. They were rejecting. Well, that's one way to say it, that diversity in a way, one of the things you do see if you read the New York Times, I don't recommend it, but it's hard to get away from. They like to write articles, not just the Times, but so much of the left likes to write articles about whatever is going on right now that you think is unprecedented and harmful, don't worry about it, it's always been that way. So they'll say things like, well, diversity has always been part of the American story. Now, to some extent, that's true. Diversity was something the founders had to contend with from the beginning. They had a mostly English, but not entirely English country. They had a mostly Protestant, but not entirely Protestant country. Whatever demographic category you want to name, you could say there was a preponderance, but not a universality. They had to contend with that. They had to find a new basis for political legitimacy, and they come up with equality and consent as sort of binary stars, neither of which makes sense without the other. And this replaces, for lack of a better term, I think if you want to simplify it, it's true, essentially a divine right of kings, however well practiced. Here I must thank Charles Kesler, my graduate school teacher, for making us read Locke's first treatise, which nobody reads anymore. You read the second treatise if you read anything at all in today's academy, but nobody reads the first treatise, which is all what Locke is essentially attacking and trying to replace with the second treatise. Poor Azarad wrote his dissertation on the first treatise, and if he were here, he'd talk about it, but he ain't. All right, so all men are created equal in consent is a way of finding a new basis for political legitimacy and molding together a diverse people. Now, they'd already been molded together because they'd been together, they lived together and fought together, struggled together for a century and a half. To some extent, nationhood depends on two contrary ideas coming together in one thing, meaning togetherness and separateness. The people are one thing together, but they are separate from other peoples. So, you have to reconcile those two principles. The ideal of American citizenship in this sense is probably best summed up since I think somebody said earlier, you can't give a speech at a Claremont event without mentioning Lincoln. I will do it now. Speech of July 4th, 1858, known as the Electric Cord speech, where he talks about the principles of the founding, and specifically of the Declaration of Independence, or the electric cord that binds the nation together, and it's how America has been more successful than any other country by far at taking people from all over and making them Americans, right? Or as Chris Caldwell said, also quoting a different Lincoln speech, that was the central idea from which all minor thoughts radiate. Okay. This is a sound principle, but it has its limits. Now, if you were to ask the founders, is this principle simply true and applicable everywhere, they would have said yes. If you then followed up with, does that mean the carrying capacity of any nation that adopts this principle is completely unlimited, and it can take an innumerate amount, or in principle, unlimited amount of people from anywhere and make the principle work in practice on the ground in the here and now, they would have said, of course not. That's idiocy. But conservatives, I think, certain cast of conservatives rightly fell in love with Lincoln and the principles of the Declaration of Independence, but then took that lesson to an extreme, to a kind of, somebody else, Raheem mentioned deference. I think they made deference to the principle and any suggestion of the limits to the principle as some kind of act of impiety or blasphemy. And this has made conservatives, I think, hesitant, more than hesitant, afraid to say anything about potentially limiting immigration, pluralism, multiculturalism, identity politics in any way. Okay, and the left uses this against us constantly. I think everybody in this room knows that. And we don't, at least people in this room know that, I'd like to think. I don't know that the conservatives at large know that. I think they don't. And this is why the tactic is so effective. I'm going to quote something else from another, this is a private remark somebody made to me in a completely different context, but it's apt. This person, we were poring over a map of a military situation in a certain part of the world, and he was explaining to me what was going on here, and enemy here, and our troops here, and we were allowing this and not doing this. And as he explained, it all came together, and I thought, wow, that's really disastrous and idiotic. Why are we doing it this way and not the other way? Why don't we stop that there if it would be so easy? And I asked all these questions, and he looked at me and he gave me a very short, 3-word answer. He said, because we suck. Conservatives suck at this. They are being constantly rolled over and over again in debate and in politics, and they either realize it and feel like, well, we just have there's nothing else we can do, the principle is sacrosanct, or they don't even realize that they're getting rolled. Now, hey, it should be obvious why the left goes on the way they go, but I'll give you what I think are the 3 primary reasons. Henry touched on one. They think it's identity politics, multiculturalism, whatever you want to call it, I think leftists would say. It's a necessary redress for past injustice. History is essentially a ledger of wrongs, and the ledger is incredibly unbalanced. We're going to right the wrongs. We're going to redress the ledger. Some of the more unhinged would add to that what I would call category 2. And they're more open about this now. It's easier to prove this. It used to be, you used to have to do a little psychoanalysis to say this, but now they'll say it more or less openly, which is, this is different than redress, related but different, which is revenge, right? I or my ancestors suffered some wrong, now you and your ancestors are going to suffer some wrong. And this is the way the universe should work. It's just, you have it coming. I'd like to think that's still a minority view, but it's certainly present among the most committed of the leftist activists. And the third reason, the reason why what another one of our fellows who is not here would call the ruling class believes in this ideology, is because they make a lot of money from it. It really does work out in their favor. It helps them maintain their grip on power and profit from it. Which of these 3 predominates? It's hard to say. I don't know. I think probably for now number 3, because the people who really run the levers of power are doing it primarily for the cash reason. Doesn't mean it doesn't have all of these ancillary effects, though, whatever motive you're doing. So then the question is, the question that I struggle with mostly, a lot, which is how can this system be kept going, right? Now, the ruling class is very comfortable with it. As Chris Caldwell said, this has now become the minor thought from which, or the central idea from which all our minor thoughts radiate. So going from his 3 categories, right, we've gone from a fact, and the value judgment is, it is good, thou shalt not question. It's impossible to question this. I mean, even for a conservative, you know the hammer's going to come down. And so we self-censor on this point. And then the third is the regime that puts it in place. Every center of power, whether we're talking about corporations, banks and the finance industry, elite institutions, cultural institutions, academic institutions, they are all in for this project, and they use their considerable power to enforce it. So our opposition has been basically ineffective. Now, I tend to think, as we have all said, and many of us have said on the earlier panels, that this is an inherently unstable situation. It doesn't seem like, the old famous Herb Stein saying, anything that can't go on forever won't. Okay, fine. How long can it's gone on for a while. How long can it go on? I don't know. But I think I do know how it ends, or at least one of 2 ways it ends. I just couldn't say when. So if you think back through history, there's actually a lot of, this is not meant to be an encouraging thought, so wait for the chaser. There is a lot of precedent for successful multicultural states, right? 2 main examples I can think of lasted a pretty long time. One is the Roman Empire, and the other is the Holy Roman Empire. But notice what those states were. They were not democratic. They were not liberal. They were not small r Republican. They were not based on anything we recognize as an American principle from the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the speeches of Abraham Lincoln, and so on, and many of our great heroes. So while there's plenty of precedent for a multicultural state, there's no precedent for a multicultural liberal democracy or anything like the American Republic. To paraphrase Lincoln once again, if we cannot arrest the further spread of this, what I call malignancy, we should get used to the fact that what we have now will be around for a long time and will get worse. I think anything that can't go on forever won't, but we ought to be starting to wrestle with the problem that people whose ideas we don't like and think are contrary to the American ideal and American history have a lot of power and momentum on their side right now and might be able to keep this going for a long time, unless we find, as we conservative intellectuals, find a way to start being effectual in our opposition. And I'm hoping that discussions and gatherings such as these is the beginnings of turning that around. Thank you.
I want to thank Brian and Tom and Charles for having me here today to be among friends, which I haven't been among so much lately. And also a shout out to Matt for the great job that Matt's doing with the American Mind. Thanks for doing that, Matt. I've revised this first sentence 3 or 4 times to be more optimistic, less optimistic. But I think America's in a crisis. The citizenry is fragmented, polarized, and angry. The media, Hollywood, and academia, sounds like a disease these days, hate the president. This elite trifecta, along with the coastal urban elite, not only loathe Trump, but they're contemptuous of middle America and traditional American values. And that goes back to the question that Charles asked Henry earlier. I don't have the stats on this, but my observations have been, even since Trump ran for election and the Inquirer asked me to write an op-ed, and I wrote one on his, was Trump a demagogue? And the editor said, no. He said, no, I want you to tell me why these people are supporting him. And this was before anybody thought that he would even win the primary. And coming from upstate New York, which is very different than where I live now on the main line, I felt like I knew people who were supporting him, because where I'm on the main line, I didn't know anyone then. And I really thought it was that they felt that they were being disdained, and that it really was a matter of honor. That they were tired of the contempt of what they saw as a class that thought themselves better than them. And so I think middle America knows that the richer, more powerful, and more famous think of them, what they think of them in their way of life. They think of them as clingers-on. They cling to their religion, their guns, their NASCAR, their blue-collar, and their middle management jobs. Their kids have college loans, big college loans, and are moving back in with them. Will they save for a future they're uncertain about? And many of these kids, now adults, living under their roofs, think their parents are out of step with the times. As people who have never known a world without the internet, legal abortion, or gay marriage, many of them see their parents and grandparents as generations that really don't understand what it's about. They don't understand globalism. They don't have empathy for social and gender constructed identities. And they don't grasp just how critical socialism and sustainability are to the future of humanity and the survival of the planet. So it's bad enough that middle America has to hear how deplorable they are from the elite trifecta. They also have to hear a version of this from their own kids. Pew Research identifies the polarization of America as primarily a partisan question, to the extent that there's been an ideological realignment in the United States, and Republicans are now more generally conservative and Democrats more progressive. This analysis is not incorrect, but there are, of course, a large number of independents these days who are watching and hoping that the partisan and ideological animosity will die down, and that more moderate and civil heads will prevail. The trouble with this view is that things may have already gone too far. The springs of society are pulled as tautly as I've ever seen them. Each side in the partisan ideological divide thinks the other side will destroy the country. The disagreement is not fundamentally about this or that policy. It's over what it means to be human and how we should live our lives. This is the stuff that revolutions are made of. In this civil battle, one side wants to preserve the American ethos and the idea of a standard maxim grounded in human nature and equality, delivering natural rights and duties. The other side rejects the phenomena of nature, including human nature, and therewith of ahistorical rights and responsibilities, and instead promotes a new direction for America. This opposition to what America has always stood for, however, while it is united against conserving the traditional principles of America, it is not monolithic in its vision for the future. It's constituted by two different chief perspectives, which are not necessarily or ultimately compatible, philosophically or even possibly politically. Now, the founders captured the challenge of America in the idea that the citizens of America are engaged in a great experiment, which sought to vindicate to the world, and in fact to themselves, that the people are capable of governing themselves. Lincoln reiterated this challenge in the expression of the idea of liberty to all, the principle that captures the word fitly spoken, which gives industry and hope to all. This is a philosophical cause that is back of the American Constitution and Union, that entwines itself about the human heart. This hope is symbolically captured in the Statue of Liberty that rises from the waters of the Hudson and beckons to humanity, all humanity, to share the dream that is America. But that's not what's believed anymore. At present, the battle to overthrow the old and institute, to quote Michael Anton, new modes and orders in the United States, has made great progress. With its home in the academy, and not just the elite universities and colleges, pretty much in the academy in general. If it's reached Villanova, you can be sure it's reached most places. So with its home in the academy, its allies in the national media, it advances its cause, but has yet to succeed. I think it's in crisis, but I don't think the war is over. It's not yet succeeded in overtaking Middle America, which has yet remained resilient, even as it is on the receiving end of the constant drumbeat of political correctness coming from the venues of television, film, newspapers, and much of social media. And lest we forget, the Academy has their children. The children of Middle America are virtually captive within its walls, learning to hate what their parents stand for. And outside these walls, these same parents are working long, hard hours to give their children what they think will make their lives not only more successful, but make them happy. They think their children are receiving a genuine and worthwhile liberal education. But instead, what the youth of America are receiving is a new dispensation. It includes multiculturalism, diversity studies, inclusion, globalism, sustainability, identity politics, social constructs, transgenderism, and I would say there's actually even something beyond that, and it's called transhumanism. The battle lines are drawn. The defenders of liberal education are now outnumbered, and significantly so. However, those who are out to destroy liberal education, and with it liberty, are not, as I've mentioned, a monolithic group, at least not philosophically. One group is the social justice warriors, whose object is as much activism as it is inquiry and scholarship. Their philosophical bearing is historicist, with capitalism and discrimination considered the chief enemies. These academics are woke to the needs of an evolving, quote, humanity, unquote. in a new and better society, a utopian vision rooted in German idealism, Marxism, and progressivist notions of egalitarianism and historical human improvement, if not perfectibility. Allied politically with the social justice warriors against traditional liberal education and its straight white male dominance and oppression are the postmoderns. Taking Marxism a step further, postmoderns such as Foucault deem the tearing down of all grand narratives to be the objective. Like neo-Marxists, democratic socialists, and social justice warriors, postmoderns reject the idea of nature and of human nature and rights as foundationally grounded. But unlike philosophical progressivists, postmoderns reject the notion of social progress or any shared vision of a good society. These people really aren't friends in the university. In place of the utopian idea of the historical process, postmoderns claim that there is nothing except for hierarchies of privilege and power. Everything is a matter of human will, social construction, interpretation. Everything is thrones, dominations, power. With this power struggle are various oppressed groups such as those based on race, ethnicity, gender, identity, religion, sexual orientation, class, and so on, which are the categories at Villanova that we are being rated on by our students now to see if we're sufficiently sensitive to all of these. These identifiers are themselves social constructs, fluid, overlapping, intersectional, and infinite. Reason has no ability to bridge understanding between and among the various groups. Instead, there's only diversity, hierarchy, and hate. This divisiveness, suspicion, animosity, and sheer contempt that characterize life in the contemporary university has bled into American society. It's like a kind of trickle-down philosophy, if you will. The academy is the home base of the current assault on middle America and the traditional American ethos. And Dennis, Teddy and I were talking earlier, and I think Dennis is absolutely right about this. There's the media, there's Hollywood, but the home of this is the university. And if we don't recognize that and gear some of our work directly at this problem, it simply will not even be reduced. The academy is at once the main source of the hatred against Trump, as well as the reason Americans took to the polls to elect Trump, I think. In my view, Americans did not so much endorse Donald Trump the man, as they stood with him in his defiant stance against the elites who are contemptuous of them. In this, the hinterland and neighborhoods throughout the nation sent a clear message to those who considered themselves the unwashed, unwoke, and they caught the elites sleeping at the wheel, shocked to find that middle America that they themselves, the elite, did not control public opinion in their nation. I remember watching Good Morning Joe, and he just couldn't get his head around the fact that everyone wasn't listening to him. And right to the last minute, he was just every morning just shocked that he wasn't America's teacher. So what, if anything, can be done? I think to have a fighting chance, the battle must be waged not only at the level of politics and society, but it has to be fought on virtually every college campus across the nation. It's high time for parents, alumni, and concerned citizens to speak out against the madness that is enveloping these institutions and hijacking their children. It's got to be fought within the walls of the university, and it's got to be fought by the people outside the university, but taking the battle inside the walls. It's time. It's high noon at the American Academy.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you, Ryan, for that warm introduction. I wanted to stick to my assignment, which is to say something about creed and culture, or creed versus culture in ideas of American citizenship and national identity. But I thought I would preface that with a little discussion engendered by the first panel and by predecessors on this panel. I want to say something about revolution. And the great text to begin the study of revolution is really Aristotle's Politics, Book 5, for those of you who happen to have it handy in the audience.
It's in my car.
Aristotle says very common sense things, as he always does, about revolution. The cause, there's a universal cause of revolution, that is drastic political change, and then there are particular causes. And what simplifies the science of revolution is that the universal cause is always the same. It is inequality. No regime is perfectly just. Every regime has some injustice, some inequalities that are undeserved. Either people have more authority, power, income, honor than they deserve, or they have less than they deserve. And that makes every regime attackable. Every regime is vulnerable in the name of justice to being overthrown. The problem is the regime that will replace it will also be imperfectly just. But that's a discussion for another day if you're a revolutionary. Among the inequalities, Aristotle says, that are especially important in giving rise to revolution, inequalities of income are or inequalities of wealth, let's say, are very important. The haves and have-nots, the rich and the poor. But he really thinks that another inequality is perhaps even more important, and that's the inequality of honor. There's something about honor connected directly to politics, which it is instantly communicable, I think, in the kinds of emotions and reactions and political claims that are being made in the Trump era and that gave rise to the Trump era. When Hillary Clinton denounced Trump's supporters, she chose her word very carefully, as Mike Ewan was telling me reminding me of this before the panel. Deplorables. People to be deplored. People who really don't rise to the level that one would expect. They're second class, and they have second class incomes, educations, manners, religions, views of the world. And in a way, that is really the claim which I think Colleen was speaking about so eloquently, that a vast number of citizens risk being, in a way, dispossessed of citizenship or made into second-class citizens. And that constituency rallied to Trump's call in the last electoral cycle and may rally to him again. But if one steps back from the question of revolution now back to really the question of America, what is it? What are the challenges to American national unity and national identity that run the deepest and seem to offer the greatest challenge to our future as a republic? Here I want to refer to a book by Samuel Huntington, published in 2004 or 5. One of the many books that he was a university professor at Harvard, really one of the most distinguished social scientists in America, a book he wrote called Who Are We?, subtitled The Challenges to America's National Identity. This is a very interesting book. It repays reading now. I sometimes continue to assign it to my freshmen in American government to have them think about the problem of American unity. And writing at the turn of the new century, Huntington diagnosed three big challenges to American unity. The first was, Tom Klingenstein will be very glad to hear this, multiculturalism. And multiculturalism meant not just, as Chris Caldwell in his illuminating talk was saying, not the fact of pluralism, but a celebration of pluralism for its own sake or for the sake of something other than its contribution to national unity. I mean, when you had World War II movies in which, you know, every platoon consisted of the Pole and the German and the, you know, the Italian and the, you know, the sort of upper crust Yankee type and so forth, that was pluralism. But it didn't prevent them from defeating Germany and Japan and erecting new, vibrant, liberal democracies in their place and revivifying our own democracy. But the kind of multiculturalism that Huntington regards as a problem is the kind we regard as a problem, the kind that cuts against civic education and civic unity or consciousness. The second of the three challenges he pointed out was what he called transnationalism. Transnationalism is the elite notion, which I think really operates in a way behind all of the elites that Colleen was talking about. The notion that we are citizens of the world, not citizens of the United States in particular, and that we exist on an ethical consciousness far above that of ordinary American citizens who are concerned with their own. But we operate on behalf of humanity, of the universal, not of any particular, like our class or our interest or our country. No, we stand for morality. And therefore, the difference between us and everyone who has these particular interests is the difference between a moral person and a person who is not fully moral. Someone who is sunk into the sea of materialism and self-interest. Someone who is racially proud or conscious in a reactionary way, or who is a fan of his country and a patriot. That is a kind of primitive state of moral development, which state is far exceeded by that of the elites. And then the third challenge, which Huntington diagnosed, and this shows you his wonderful ability to mix large and smaller themes together, was what he called the Hispanization of America. That is the fact that so many of the current wave, the modern wave of immigrants came from nearby countries that spoke Spanish. And therefore they contributed two problems, as it were. One was the possibility of bilingualism breaking out in America, where a large mass of new immigrants and perhaps their children would continue speaking Spanish, and we would have a sort of incipient Quebec problem, as the Canadians have a French language problem. We'd have a Spanish one. And the nearness of these countries, meaning that they could go back and forth to them, and they didn't really have to choose these new immigrants to give up the old culture. They could retain it and still operate for their entire lives within America. Now, as against these challenges, Huntington said America, of course, has held together for a long time. There are countervailing forces in American society which tend to support nationhood. And there were four of them, as he diagnosed them. First, he said, race, and second, ethnicity. And now these are, as he, of course, admitted and celebrated, no longer the kind of unifying factors that they were at the end of the 18th century or early in the 19th century. America long ago ceased to be a white nation, an England, a little England, and had already become, really, by the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century, certainly, a multi cultural in that sense, a multiracial certainly, and multi-ethnic country. Liberal academics are, however, despite the fact that that is really these are no longer, from Huntington's own observations of American society, essential to American national identity, the left has never let go of these as central elements of American national identity. Rogers Smith, who is the current president of the American Political Science Association, has based the larger part of his career on writing about what he calls these traditions of ascriptive inequalities in American history. We have these formal principles of equality, all men are created equal, the creed, but the lived reality of American life has always been, Roger Smith said, infected with sexism and racism and all sorts of discriminations on the basis of unchangeable characteristics, ascriptive characteristics. All right, so race, ethnicity, but those he regards as in our past. The two that remain to hold America together against the challenges are what Huntington called ideology and culture. Ideology, he means the creed, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, equality, liberalism in the old-fashioned classical sense. And by culture, he means, after some interesting discussion, he boils it down to this interesting term, Anglo-Protestantism. The Anglo part means especially the English language as an inheritance from England and our lingua franca, so to speak. And with it, a certain kind of Protestant religious values associated with the English tradition and with the pluralist tradition, you might say, of the United States itself. Now, his previous book about America, called American Politics, The Promise of Disharmony, Sam Huntington had argued that the creed was the essence of American identity. Our loyalty, you can come from anywhere in the world, you can come from any culture, and you can still become an American because you can believe in the principles of the Declaration of Independence and promise to obey the law and to support and uphold the Constitution of the United States. Previously, at the end of the 60s and 70s, looking back at American politics, that had been Huntington's diagnosis. The creed was the essence of our identity. But the problem with the creed was that it was easily and in fact necessarily often overheated. We would be subject to what he calls, this was one of my favorite social science terms, creedal passion periods. It sounds like something that might be fun, but creedal passion period, but we get idealistic, we get the 60s, we get reform, we get revolution, riots in the streets and so forth, followed by a cycle of hypocrisy, complacency, and cynicism. So the creed, although it was the only thing that really at bottom held us together, was unstable, and so unlikely to be able to hold us together. That was the diagnosis of his first book. In order to do the job of holding American society together, you need a culture. A creed is not enough. And so the second book on America, Who Are We, that I've been talking about, made that argument. There is a culture that has emerged from America and that can come back into vogue and hold us together, and that culture is Anglo-Protestantism. It's a cultural understanding of America and of the creed. It's a kind of cultural conservatism, you could say, in which the creed still plays a part, but the creed is just an offshoot of culture, of our beliefs, of our practices as Anglo-Protestants. Now, it's a very interesting book. I don't find it entirely persuasive, but it's certainly one of the most serious attempts to ground conservatism in a cultural understanding that you will find in the American discussion. It, however, I think illustrates in many ways a kind of weakness in the American conservative understanding of America. that weakness I can put in broad terms as follows. Conservatives don't know how to be founders anymore. They don't know how to begin again in politics. And this was, the greatest illustration of this is Ronald Reagan, who began his political career calling for a new beginning, calling for a second American Revolution, and ended it acknowledging that he had failed to produce such a revolution, but had produced a Reagan Revolution. In his farewell address, Reagan took credit for the Reagan Revolution, but he also said, in a very poignant paragraph, that we had not succeeded, we had revived patriotism in America, but we had not institutionalized it. We had not persuaded the young generation, he said, to teach their children an unequivocal patriotism, an unambivalent patriotism, that America is good, that America is, bottom line, a force for good in the world and at home. That, although his administration had illustrated the truth of that proposition, it had not penetrated into the universities or into the kitchen tables of America, where parents instruct their children on what it is to be American. Now, many conservatives prefer the cultural approach, prefer culture to creed. Libertarians, on the whole, I suppose, take the other side, that creed is predominant, the ideas, the principles, the theories, and culture secondary. I want to argue really that you need both of them. And that creed is primary, or really politics is primary, and we need to think like founders. Again, we need to think politically in the deepest and the longest term sense if we're to come to grips with multiculturalism and the challenges, which are immense, to American national identity. But involved in the question of American national identity is American national respectability. Why does America deserve to survive? Why does citizenship deserve to continue to honor George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln and others? Those are the deep questions which must be answered, I think, by any successful political defense against multiculturalism and the other nefarious elements of the left. In a strange way, both the left and the right in America back in the 19th century abandoned the creed for the sake of culture. They turned everything into culture. And this is a long story which I don't have time to tell, except I will allude to it, I suppose. Progressivism, which had both Republican and Democratic sides, in fact it had more Republican sides than Democratic sides, it was more a feature of that party, and it had liberal and it had conservative sides, but they all agreed basically on the notion that progress is inevitable, and that is the future will be better than the present, even as the present is better than the past. And that the deepest problems which had prevented secular progress in the past, the problem of public and private, of reason and revelation, these conflicts that could not once and for all be solved and forever after relied upon, those great questions were being solved by the progress of the human mind in the course of the 19th century and the 20th century. That's what Hegel was all about. And it's what progressivism was all about. And there was a Whig version of this in the early 19th century and a Democratic version of it, and there was a Republican progressive and a Democratic progressive version of it at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century too. I would say that the left wing, what's left of that old monocultural understanding of America and of the West is Anglo-Protestantism on the right. That is, it's the notion that we can rescue some shards from the disintegration of universal culture and stand on those. And on the left, it's multiculturalism. We can rescue shards from that universal culture too, but it's not the same shards. It's not the white power structure. It's everyone who's been oppressed in the past by the white power structure. That's the basis on which a new world can be built. If we're thinking politically, let me say this in conclusion, like a founder, or like someone who is trying to refound his country in the face of these very deep problems and very bitter partisan disagreements, we have to think about how different groups, and I think also, Henry Olsen is quite right about this. There are huge numbers of new immigrants in the United States who don't have a direct connection by blood or by race to the American past. We have to think about how we can show them that they can offer their group and them and they individually can offer something to the common good. In other words, instead of focusing on their victimhood, what they need, what they're owed, what can they offer to America? What can they bring to us that will induce us to honor them? What is their contribution to the common good? This is what assimilation really meant in the American past. That's what those soldiers in the platoons in the World War II movies were doing. They were showing they would fight for the country. They were showing they responded to the call of duty, which meant that their claim of rights was not an empty claim or a vain claim, but was backed up by the virtues that their duties entailed upon them. We have to show that you can honor, that American citizenship itself is an honorable estate that has to be striven for, and that you have to, in a way, sacrifice for, or at least you have to honor it. In that sense, the creed still and always needs a culture. That is, it needs to protect itself and ground itself by having cultural effects, by stimulating certain kinds of aspirations to honor and to virtue and to citizenship, at the same time that it points American citizens, as always, in the direction of the Declaration of Independence and the creedal documents of the country. But it also wants them to know, to come to Washington, of all cities, to see the monuments, to see the temples built to the demigods, as Jefferson, of all people, called them, who did found the country way back when. Thank you.
We have a little time for questions. I just wanted to say, Colleen brought up transhumanism, and having recently written a longer version of my essay, and if you type into Google, "I identify as," the algorithm produces dog, cat, dragon, and furry. Although that was a month ago, James Pullis, I owe him that wisdom. He did the legwork on that one. So I just did it again on the phone, and now the top hit is Prius. I identify as a Prius. And in the wonderful encapsulation of both the identitarian aspect of this and then the coercive corporate aspect of this, there's also a little thing under the search bar that says report inappropriate recommendations. So, with that, we'll open the floor for questions. Yes, back there.
Thank you very much. Throughout this panel and some of the previous panel, common theme has been that group rights are deeply destructive to social fabric. At the same time, however, all of you in your own ways have asserted the right of society or of nations, that is, the right of a kind of group to restrict immigration and to decide who gets to be a member in society. Is this itself a kind of group right, the right to decide who's a citizen? And if so, what differentiates it from the other group rights that are problematic?
I guess no. Yes and no. Look, if we want to go back to the Declaration of Independence, it does begin by saying that it makes two claims to rights, right? There are individual human rights, and then there are the right of each nation to assume the separate and equal station vis-a-vis other nations that nature and nature's God provide for, right? What is incoherent in theory and impossible in practice is a kind of third way, which is we're asserting the group right of the nation to be separate, whether it's a blood and soil France with 1,000 years of post-Frankish history, or an America that declares itself a nation and has a birthday. In either one of those, a concept of group rights within the nation already established, you can't make a case for it that is coherent in theory. If we had Locke himself here today and said, we'll give you 48 hours, come back with this, I don't think he could do it. If you gave him a month, I don't think he could do it. And as it works out in practice, it just descends into tribal competition, which is, and I don't know that the tribes would necessarily recognize this, but it would be theoretically indistinguishable from the divine right of kings, which means we have our gods, you have your gods, we're fighting over a finite pie, our group gets stuff because of our claim descending from our gods. And now that's okay, or at least it's feasible, if there's a border between the two tribes, and each tribe has its own self-governing set of institutions and is related to the other tribe vis-a-vis foreign policy. If each tribe is within the same border and they have the same set of ostensible governing institutions and they're fighting over spoils within, you couldn't even call it a nation in that sense, but within some kind of central government, it's just a recipe for endless conflict in practice.
I would just answer that by saying that you're using the word rights in two different senses. In one case, it's individual rights, but when you talk about citizens of a country, what you're really talking about there is their authority to do certain things. So it's not really particularly the second example, a question of rights per se.
There have been a number of people who have raised concerns about the rhetorical appeal of being anti-multiculturalism. But in the spirit of thinking like founders, I'm curious whether, from an intellectual standpoint, if the speakers think that multiculturalism actually captures the project of the left. Do they really want multiple cultures, or do they really want to impose one new culture defined by the radical left, imposed by the state and their allies in corporate America, a culture that's opposed to traditional American culture?
I don't know if I would call it, I think they're more cynical than that. I think the ruling class doesn't really care about multiculturalism the way an SJW or a woke college professor does. And that is for its own sake and genuinely. They see it as a wonderful tool, however, to preserve their rule, cement their legitimacy, and buy off opposition. And they use it very effectively in those terms. I think they laugh all the way to the bank. So as far as they're concerned, as long as, I think it was, maybe no, it was Matt who said, political correctness is the enforcement arm of multiculturalism or identity politics. They're very much concerned with the latter as a useful tool of keeping everybody in line and being unchallenged in their perch at the top of the pyramid. So if I may, just what Charles said about Aristotle, inequality of honor versus inequality of wealth. I wrote a piece 5 years ago or so for the CRB called San Francisco Values, where I tried to explain this. And the main point that I did this really long. It was like 800 words. Thank you for that, by the way, Charles. But one of the main points that I tried to get across was, look, we have both. The current oligarchical arrangement that governs the United States is both. There's a massive concentration of wealth that, unlike I don't know of another time in history where wealth had
impecunious masses out ready to voluntarily go to the barricades on its behalf, like we have now. And one of the ways they enlist and keep those soldiers faithful is by saying, well, we're not going to share the money. I mean, we're not stupid, right? I mean, we're going to be the billionaires and you're going to be whatever you are. But we will make sure that you are heaped honors by us and by the various institutions that we control and the media organizations that we control, and that we also insult your enemies on your behalf constantly. And apparently we've got, I don't know, 50 or 100 million people in America who really like that arrangement, and they're fine with it and they're happy, even though in financial terms, they're not doing all that well off this arrangement.
Yes, sir. Back.
I would imagine that most people on the podium have thought a lot more about leftism than most leftists in academia. But I'm wondering if we are ceding too much ground when we take their ideas seriously. It seems to me as though we're thinking very, very deeply about what these people, I think most Americans probably would not agree with at all. I think that if you took the average American and started, saying what most people on college campuses might think, most people would jump back in revulsion. So I'm wondering if we're getting too esoteric. That's pretty much basically my question.
Well, it's there may be some truth to that critique, but I would say that the incredible prestige of the academy underlies liberalism and all that it tries to do, and in whatever humble ways one can subtract from that prestige, I think those are useful. Politically and morally the right thing to do, and intellectually the right thing to do. But it is, the great stumbling block to conservative politics has been for several generations now, the prestige of the university. This was Bill Buckley's concern in his first book in 1951, God, Man at Yale, and it is even more a problem, and a deeper and more radical problem now than it was then. We have not solved that problem. We have not come close to solving that problem. And thinking seriously about that problem, it seems to me, is a requisite, a duty in our situation.
I think too, if I could add to what Charles said, that it might seem ridiculous to people outside the academy, but inside the academy, it doesn't seem ridiculous to the young people there. And something has changed in the last, 5 or 6 years. The millennials were pretty much more relativists. And so there were a number of things that they were taught that they went in one ear and out the other. You could have all these requirements, and it affected some of them, but a lot of them just went about their business and did what they had to do and went out and tried to get jobs. That's not what's going on now. Generation Z is a different generation. They're not moral relativists. They're social justice warriors, and they are soaking this in like a sponge. And so this is going to affect society much more in the next few years than it is right now. And it's already doing it right now quite a lot, I think.
Over here. Yeah, our last question, my apologies, we ran out of time.
Thank you. So my name is Max Meislish, and as a member of the somewhat elusive young people generation that conservatives are always trying to understand and convince, and I am a lifelong conservative. My concern is that sitting here for 2.5 hours maybe, I still remain wholly unconvinced that multiculturalism is the right way of framing this conversation. And it worries me because I'm a sympathetic member of the audience, and I came here from, I think, listening to a podcast where, Ryan, you were the guest, and I started reading The American Mind. This is how I'm here. I'm curious, what are the alternatives? Are we not doing a good job of really explaining why this is the right framework? And I'm sitting here and I came up with a couple of ideas. Is identitarianism a good way of thinking of this? Cultural progressivism, identitarianism. I'd really be interested in the panel's thoughts on this, and just for the record to reflect that I think that there's great concern from someone like me, because I would not want to go out to a bar in DC and say, I was at a panel today on multiculturalism versus America and have to defend that, even though I really do agree with a lot of the underlying arguments that are being presented here.
Look, the word, I mean, this is a marketing question, I guess, and we'll be hashing it out for a while. The word does have an overwhelmingly, in certain circles, positive connotation that may be impossible for us to overcome. I don't know, but whatever we call it, the phenomena will be the same. So we need to figure out, some wonderful, devastating put down like low energy, or I don't know what it would be. But I will say, look, I worked in Washington a long time ago, and then I went away, and then I came back. And one of the people that I had known and not really talked to since I had been away, we went out to dinner one night, and he was just a typical liberal member of the Washington crowd. I don't know how we got on the topic, but somehow and he used the word multiculturalism, and I said, well, I'm against it, and I tried to explain what I was for, and he was just appalled. It was like I'd said, I'm against God, I'm against existence, I'm against this restaurant not being bombed in the next 5 minutes while we sit here, and basically what he came down to was, well, but my wife's from Peru, that means you think I shouldn't have married her, and I had to try to unwind the entire ball of yarn and say, no, and I got nowhere. All he heard was the word, I didn't like it. It was a religious reaction with him. I think we're going to face that in a lot of places. The question is, are we facing that only in places? I'm never going to talk that guy out of what he believes, right? And there's a whole bunch of SJW types who, no matter how we label it, we're not going to convince them to come over to our side. What works best on a persuadable middle, that's what we need to find. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, Jean Kirkpatrick, in her famous speech to the Republican National Convention, attacked what she called the San Francisco Democrats. They were meeting in San Francisco at what?
The Moscone Center.
Yes. Anyway, and but she said she called them the "Blame America First" crowd. Something. It may be something along those lines. Anti-American. The problem is, of course, you have to pin that on them. You have to, and it would help if they would accept the label.
Well, they're getting more pliant about that now, because I think either because the veil is lifting, and so they feel like we're so in control of the culture now that we have the whip hand, we can say what we've always believed, or because they feel like this plays to the base well. But for instance, MAGA put them on a very terrible spot that they haven't figured out how to deal with it yet. And so I was delighted when Andrew Cuomo said, America, make America great. It was never that great. I wasn't delighted because I agreed with him. I was delighted because I thought, well, now he can never be president. So that's one down that I don't have to worry about. They still haven't figured out how to react to that. But increasingly, I think they are being bolder and going, yeah, it was never that great. It is nothing but a sum total of its sins. And I think the more they're open about that, perhaps the easier our road may be.
God Bless America is being retired, by the Phillies, by the Yankees, and increasingly by the Democrats. And so they may do us the favor of embracing the Jeremiah Wright, "Goddamn America" school of thought.
Well, my thank you to you all for that. And I will mention there's quite a few people on the periphery. We're bringing in another table for lunch. They're going to set up a buffet. We'll start to eat, and then I'll introduce Chris to you in half an hour or so, and we'll get into the finishing part of the program. So thank you.